Have you ever noticed how silence doesn't always mean absence? Sometimes, silence is the most present thing in the room. It echoes in places where words used to live. It vibrates in spaces where explanations once begged to be heard. Not all silence is punishment. Some silence is a form of liberation, the final act of self-respect after years of trying to be understood. Freud once said, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." And sometimes the ugliest way they return is not through anger, not through tears, but through calm, through peace, through the kind of silence that doesn't ask, doesn't beg, doesn't explain, because it doesn't need to. Picture this: a man who always felt in control of himself, of others, of her. A man used to being the center of emotional gravity, where women orbit around his coldness, trying to warm him with affection, attention, patience. He's used to pulling strings without consequences. He's used to watching her come back, again and again, as if her devotion was a law of nature. But then, something changes. No final text. No tearful goodbye. No begging. No closure. Just a woman who vanishes emotionally, without storming out, without slamming the door, without accusing him of anything. She doesn't need to, because something inside her already died long before she left. She had been mourning their connection in silence, while smiling in his presence. She had been grieving the loss of her own dignity in every moment she accepted less than she deserved. Freud believed the ego often protects us from truths we are not ready to face. It creates defense mechanisms, denial, projection, rationalization, to keep us functioning. This man? He's living inside that ego shell. He doesn't recognize what just happened. Not yet. His mind says, she'll come back. They always come back. Because to him, love was a script, predictable, controlled, whereas emotional absence was a test, and her love was always the answer. But she's no longer playing his game. She's not reacting, not responding. She's rewriting the script. And suddenly, his ego, so used to applause, so used to being desired, is left alone on the stage. Tell me, have you ever stopped talking not because you were angry, but because there was nothing left to say? Have you ever chosen silence, not as a weapon, but as a sanctuary? If you have, you already know what power lives in that stillness. He doesn't feel it immediately, not on the surface. Men like him don't bleed right away. They carry wounds like ghosts, quiet, cold, unseen. At first, he laughs. He scrolls through his feed. He flirts. He posts. He tells himself a story. She needed space. She's just emotional. She'll come back once she calms down. But Freud taught us something that men like him don't understand. When the unconscious speaks, it doesn't use logic. It uses symptoms. And now they begin. At night, he stares at the screen longer than usual. He checks her profile, not obsessively. Not yet, just curiously. But curiosity, Freud would say, is often the first symptom of unconscious grief. He replays old memories in his head. The last time she smiled, the way she used to touch his shoulder when she laughed, the sound of her voice, not when she was upset, but when she was still trying. And now he realizes he doesn't hear that voice anymore, not because she stopped speaking, but because she stopped hoping. This is what Freud called the return of the repressed. When something you refuse to see comes back in dreams, in sensations, in moods that seem to have no origin. And when a woman chooses silence, not from coldness, but from growth, she becomes the mirror spent his whole life avoiding. And in that mirror, he doesn't see her. He sees himself, empty, alone, and finally exposed. He doesn't miss you, not really. What he misses is how he felt about himself when you were still there. This distinction is subtle, but critical. Because he's not grieving a connection. He's grieving a mirror that stopped reflecting the version of himself he enjoyed the most. Freud called it narcissistic injury, a wound to the ego inflicted when the source of admiration, validation, and emotional catering is suddenly gone. He believed he was loved for who he was, but he was never truly known. He was simply reflected in your patience, and your kindness, and your belief that he would grow. You weren't his partner. You were his mirror. Point one that always tilted in his favor, until you didn't. And when the mirror turns away, when it no longer reflects flattery, the narcissistic ego doesn't feel sorrow. It feels disorientation. He begins to search, not for you, but for the feeling of being adored. He scrolls through old photos, not because he misses your face, but because those images remind him of a time when he didn't have to question his worth. You were his emotional background music, soothing, predictable, always on. Now it's quiet. And in that silence, he doesn't know who he is. This is the moment most women confuse for regret. But it's not. It's not about love, that it's about the absence of supply. The man who once pulled away, ghosted, delayed replies, now sends a vague message, "Hey, you good?" He's not checking in on your well-being, he's checking in on his influence. Because in the mind of the emotionally immature, if you're still thinking about them, they still matter. Freud described this behavior as emotional regression, the ego returning to an earlier stage of development to avoid confronting emotional reality. He doesn't want to face the truth that the woman who once offered him emotional shelter has found her own. That her silence isn't strategy, it's a sign of psychological maturation. And the man who once held the center of her world now finds himself outside of it, wandering its edges, trying to sneak back in without earning the key. At this point, he begins to justify. To himself, to others, to the version of you he keeps replaying in his mind. He tells himself, she was too emotional. She wanted too much. She never understood me. But those stories aren't about truth, they're about control. Because if he can reduce you to a flaw, he can protect himself from the truth that you evolved without him. Freud said, most people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibility. And now your freedom, your calm, detached, unshakable silence, forces him to confront the very responsibility he avoided all along, the responsibility of becoming emotionally accountable. He doesn't know it yet, but this is the beginning of his internal split. The unconscious begins to stir. He dreams of you, not romantic dreams, symbolic ones. You're there, but always just out of reach. You're looking at him, but not waiting, not hoping. And when he wakes up, there's a sensation in his chest, not love, but lack. Not longing for you, but longing for the power he once felt when you were still reachable. Have you ever mistaken a man's sudden attention for love when it was really just him trying to regain control? Have you ever been contacted out of nowhere, only to realize you were being tested, not cherished? This is the anatomy of narcissistic craving, not for connection, but for confirmation. He doesn't want your heart. He wants to know it's still open. But now it isn't. And this is where you begin to rise. Not above him, but beyond the version of yourself that once needed his attention to feel worthy. Freud wrote, "We are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love." But now you love differently. You love with boundaries. You love with presence. You love with your eyes wide open. And the man who once confused your compassion with weakness is now left staring at the door you closed, without a sound, without a scream, without a single explanation. Because the version of you that used to explain no longer exists. It doesn't happen all at once, not in loud cries, not in sudden apologies. It happens in small cracks, overlooked moments, in things that once felt normal and now feel off. When Freud spoke of repression, he wasn't just referring to forgotten memories. He meant emotional truths, buried deep beneath the surface, locked away by the ego, because the psyche isn't ready to face them. But what's buried always returns, and when it does, it doesn't speak. It trembles. At first, he thinks he's fine. He laughs. Posts. Works. He even tells his friends, she'll be back. She always needs time. But there's a shift in his sleep. He wakes in the middle of the night, not from a nightmare, but from a feeling, an undefined ache. He forgets to respond to messages. He becomes irritable at work. He finds himself staring at his phone longer than he should, wondering if you saw his last post. Not because he misses you, but because he needs to know if he's still being seen. Freud taught us that when emotional repression becomes too great, the unconscious begins to speak through the body, through tension, through appetite, through disrupted sleep, through that vague sense of unease that has no obvious cause, but refuses to go away. And now, he feels it, not as heartbreak, but as instability. His routine starts to fall apart. He forgets his gym bag, misses deadlines, snaps at someone over something trivial, then apologizes, unsure why he reacted that way. It's not about you, he tells himself, but his body tells another story. He tries to reset, goes out, drinks, scrolls through apps, but something's off. The women he meets don't mirror him the way you did. They don't laugh at his jokes the same way. Don't feel familiar. Don't feel safe. Because what he's chasing isn't a person. It's the emotional shelter he once had and dismissed. Have you ever seen someone fall apart, but pretend everything is fine? Have you ever watched a man who once seemed untouchable begin to crumble silently? This is not about punishment. This is not revenge. This is what happens when silence becomes a mirror to everything he refused to feel. And now he can't avoid it. Because your absence, which he once thought would fade, has become the loudest voice in his life. In his dreams you appear, but you're not the same. You're distant, that you're calm, that you're no longer waiting for him. Sometimes he sees you smiling at someone else. Other times you're walking away, but never looking back. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. And in those dreams, he's not missing you, that he's mourning the loss of control, that of emotional dominance, that of the version of himself that existed only when you believed in him. Now he questions himself. Why am I feeling this? Why do I care now? Was I wrong? But he doesn't speak those questions aloud, that he buries them, as he buried everything else. And so the symptoms continue. A sudden tightness in his chest when your name appears, that a burst of irritation when someone brings you up, an empty look in the mirror when he realizes he no longer feels proud of what he sees. Because when the unconscious begins to rise, the ego starts to tremble, and he, the man who once felt untouchable, begins to feel everything. You're not there, but you are. In the background music at the cafe, and the shape of a sentence someone else speaks, and the energy of a place you once stood together. You are not haunting him. You are simply the part of himself he's been trying to avoid, the part that wanted to be loved genuinely, but didn't know how to accept it. And now, there's no one left to perform for. Just himself, and the silence he thought would protect him. Tell me, have you ever seen a man unravel not because of your words, but because of your absence? Have you ever realized your silence was more powerful than any confrontation you could have had? If so, share your story, because what he can't express, you may have already understood, and your clarity might help another woman choose herself today. Eventually he reaches out. Not because he has changed, not because he's found clarity, but because he feels something he doesn't recognize, a loss of access. And in his world, access has always meant control. His ego wasn't ready for your silence, not that kind. Not the kind that doesn't wait, not the kind that doesn't explain, not the kind that doesn't offer the chance for him to fix things on his own terms. It starts with something small, that a reaction to your story. How have you been? A memory dropped casually. This song reminded me of you. But beneath the message, what he's really saying is, do I still exist in your world? Freud explained that the ego, when threatened, will reach not for reconciliation, but for reassurance. This isn't a gesture of love, but it's a test of his reflection in your eyes. He's not reaching out to connect, he's reaching out to see if you'll still reflect him the way you used to. But you're no longer there, not in the way he remembers, not in the way he needs. You may reply, you may not, but either way, you no longer offer the version of yourself that he was once addicted to. Because she, the woman who answered right away, who softened at his attention, who melted at his half-efforts, no longer exists. Freud called it the compulsion to repeat, the drive to recreate old dynamics in the hope of mastering them. And now, he's trying to recreate the moment you used to return, the moment you used to light up when he reappeared. But repetition has lost its power, because while he was rehearsing the same act, you were becoming someone else entirely. He repeats the script, but the scene has changed, the audience is gone, the spotlight is off, and the stage is empty. He tells himself stories to stay calm. Maybe she's busy. Maybe she's playing hard to get. She's probably still angry. But the truth is far simpler and more terrifying to him. You're not angry that you're not playing, that you're just free. And that kind of emotional detachment is what the narcissistic ego fears the most. Not rage, not confrontation, but indifference. Because indifference can't be argued with. It can't be seduced. It can't be controlled. Have you ever responded out of curiosity, only to feel nothing? Have you ever looked at a man who once pulled your heart in all directions and suddenly realized he no longer moves you at all? That's not coldness, that's not cruelty, that's growth. That's what it feels like to finally choose yourself. Freud once said, we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. But what he also showed us is that love evolves. And when it no longer aligns with our sense of self, when it begins to cost us more than it gives, we don't stop loving, we transform what we love. You once loved him, but now you love your peace more, your clarity, your center. And that love doesn't need to chase. So he sends another message, a compliment, nostalgic reference, maybe even a voice note, hoping to trigger the past. But what comes back, if anything, is not the echo he expected. Your energy has changed, your rhythm is different, you don't respond to the same emotional hooks. And now, he's not sure what's real anymore, because if you're no longer his mirror, who is he? In trying to reclaim you, what he really wants is to reclaim the version of himself that existed when he believed you were his. But that version of him was built on the comfort of your presence, not the strength of his character. And now that you've removed the comfort, he's left with himself, just himself. And for the first time in a long time, he doesn't know what to do with that. So now I ask you, have you ever responded without reacting, listened without leaning in, replied without reopening the door? If you have, you've already walked through the phase where his presence no longer defines your path. Tell me, has he reached out, but found that you're no longer where he left you? Share it in the comments. Your experience might become the clarity another woman needs. There comes a moment when he realizes the mirror is no longer there. No more reflection.n, oh more reaction.n, oh more feedback, just silence. And in that stillness, he finally begins to see himself. Not the version of himself you once affirmed, not the role he played to keep you near, but the raw, unpolished, unprotected truth. Freud taught us that the ego is a structure built to survive, to adapt, to defend, to protect. But when the source of its narcissistic fuel is gone, when the other, who once made it feel whole, walks away, the ego begins to fracture. And from that fracture, something deeper emerges. Not insight at first, but discomfort, doubt, a slow unraveling of illusions. He walks through his life now like it's a rehearsal, same routine, same places, same people. But everything feels off. He gets dressed but doesn't feel attractive, that he speaks but doesn't feel heard, that he smiles but doesn't feel happy. Because what used to affirm him, your attention, your admiration, your softness, is no longer in the room. And when a man has lived too long through external validation, he forgets how to generate any from within. Freud wrote that man is not a creature of logic, but of impulses and repressions. And now, with no one left to project his unresolved shadows onto, those repressed parts begin to surface. He's not just sad, he's destabilized. He's not missing you. He's being haunted by the absence of who he thought he was. The mask is cracking, the persona he wore in your presence is falling apart, and beneath it, there is no clear self. Only fragments, wounds, patterns he never understood, questions he never asked. Have you ever watched someone fall into silence, not because they chose peace, but because they could no longer hold their performance together? Have you ever realized that what you thought was strength was actually just distraction? This is what happens when the mirror breaks. He's not facing you anymore, he's facing himself. At night, he stares at the ceiling, not remembering moments with you, but remembering moments with himself. The things he said, the things he didn't, the way he dismissed your needs, not because they were too much, but because they exposed his lack. And now that you're gone, those needs echo back, like questions with no answers. Why couldn't he listen? Why did he run from your softness? Why did he think you never leave? Freud often spoke of conflict as the birthplace of consciousness, and now the conflict is real, inside him. He is torn between memory and denial, between guilt and ego, between who he thought he was and who he now sees in the mirror. And that mirror no longer flatters, .it no longer lies, .it reflects brutally and honestly. There he sees a man who ignored love, who avoided growth, who mistook your patience for permanence. He realizes that silence was never empty, it was full of everything he couldn't hear while he still had you. It held your exhaustion, your quiet boundaries, your last lines of dignity. And now it holds him, like a truth he can't escape, like a consequence he can't undo. And what about you? Have you ever become so still, so centered, that someone had to finally confront what your presence once protected them from? Have you ever stopped being their mirror and watched them flail in the absence of reflection? That's not vindication, it's clarity. It's the return of your own gaze to yourself. Freud said, we are what we are because we have been what we have been. But sometimes we become something else, not because we forget who we were, but because we finally chose who we want to be. You chose. And now he must face the man that was only lovable when seen through your light. Now that your light is gone, he begins to see his own shadows. At some point, he makes one final attempt. A longer message, a confession, I've been thinking about us, filled with words he never knew how to say when you were still there. But it's too late, not because you're angry, not because you're punishing him, but because you're no longer reachable in the way he once knew you. You haven't closed the door with hate, you've simply walked through another one that led back to yourself. Freud once said, the goal of therapy is to make the unconscious conscious. And that's exactly what your silence has done. You didn't just leave him, you found you. And in that finding, you discovered something far more valuable than any return, any apology, any "I've changed." You discovered that your wholeness is not negotiable. So he sends a message. He opens his heart, or at least tries to. And for a second, your chest tightens, because the old you would have answered immediately. Would have felt seen. Would have hoped again. But the woman who reads that message now is not the girl who once waited by the phone. You're not rushing. You're not leaning. You're not folding into emotion. You feel the words. You honor the pain behind them, but you don't belong to that frequency anymore. Freud didn't just speak of suffering. He spoke of liberation through knowledge, through naming the internal chaos and choosing a new relationship with it. That's what you've done. While he was looking outward, you were going inward. While he chased validation, you met your loneliness. You held your own ache. You listened to the silence until it taught you how to breathe again. And now, you are not harder. You are clearer. You are not colder. You are anchored. And maybe you felt it too. That moment when he comes back and everything he says is what you once prayed to hear, but somehow it doesn't move you. Not because he's insincere, but because you are no longer where he left you. He's speaking to someone who doesn't exist anymore. The version of you who accepted crumbs, who mistook intensity for intimacy, who waited. She's gone. Not out of bitterness, but because you've returned to your center. And now you don't react, you respond, if at all, with consciousness. You don't rush to forgive. You don't leap into hope. You stand in a place of stillness he doesn't know how to navigate. Because for him, love was control, and for you, love has become freedom. Freud taught that individuation is the painful, necessary path from illusion to truth, from merging to separation. He believed we often love not as we are, but as we fear being alone. But once we learn to stand alone, once we learn that solitude doesn't mean abandonment, we stop chasing emotional ghosts. You stopped. You don't fear the silence anymore. You've befriended it. And in doing so, you created a life that no longer needs to be rescued. So now he watches, maybe from a distance, maybe in silence. He sees your posts, he hears about you from others, and what he notices now isn't your beauty, your laughter, or your warmth. He notices your absence from the place he once took for granted. And the hardest part, he realizes that nothing he says can take him back to the version of you that still waited. Because that version of you was never meant to last. She was the bridge, you are the destination. Tell me honestly, have you ever looked back and realized you didn't miss him? You missed who you were trying to be when you were with him? Have you ever discovered in the stillness of your own company that you are no longer a question waiting to be answered? That you are the answer? If so, share your story. Because somewhere out there, a woman is still standing on that emotional bridge, unsure if she should wait or finally walk away. And your story, your choice, might be the signal she's been waiting for. Freud said, out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. And you, in your silence, in your softness, in your refusal to return to what broke you, have become strong. Not in a way that shuts down love, but in a way that chooses it consciously. You don't close the door with anger, you leave it open, but walk past it with grace. And if one day he truly becomes the man he was supposed to be, he'll understand. You didn't leave him, you returned to yourself. And that's a place he can no longer follow.